the Aegis Rotunda, watched the Acheron tier break apart in total, manufactured silence. 41,809 people stopped existing between one breath and the next. The debris field held no sound, vacuum had no ears, but the rotunda's visual feed did. The council delegates sat in their tiered rings, watching the wreckage tumble against the black. No one spoke. The architecture itself seemed to be holding its breath. Sovereign-elector Vian So of the Zarithian hegemony leaned forward in his seat, needle teeth visible behind an expression that might have been a smile. He reached down and placed a crystalline metronome on his console. It was beautiful in the way precision instruments are beautiful, all angled faces and internal mechanisms visible through transparent casings. The tick was audible across the chamber. Deliberate. Mocking. Your parliament will spend 6 weeks debating the semantics of surrender, Vianso said. His voice carried the weight of someone who had already won. So I will give you the courtesy of a deadline. He didn't name a number. The metronome did that work for him. Tick, tick, tick. High Minister Elena Rostova sat in the human delegation's forward section. She was a small woman by the standards of that chamber. Most species in the Aegis Rotunda were built for spectacle, but what she lacked in size, she made up for in stillness. She did not reach for the console beside her. She did not look away from the casualty feeds scrolling down the secondary displays. 41,809 was a number that required a face. She was giving them one. Her hands were steady. That was the first thing to know about Elena Rostova. In moments when other people's hands shook, hers did not. Vianso continued, his voice layered with the certainty of a predator that has already run the mathematics of the hunt. The Acheron tier was destroyed due to an administrative oversight, a lamentable accident. However, as the hegemony was conducting a legitimate security operation in that sector, and the orbital structure was in violation of 17 subsection codes regarding. There are 41,809 names, Rostova said. Her voice was quiet. In the Aegis Rotunda, that meant everyone heard it. Vianso's smile didn't waver. Names are irrelevant to procedure, High Minister. What is relevant is that humanity accepts the following: immediate and total military subordination to hegemony command. All Earth-based weapons systems will be surrendered. All colonial vessels will be remanded. Earth itself will be reclassified as a protectorate under perpetual hegemony administration. The tick of the metronome cut through the silence like a blade. And if we refuse, Rostova asked. Then the next accident will occur over your homeworld, Vianso said simply. The Acheron tier had, 17,000 colonists. Earth has 9 billion. I am curious which calculation your democracy will require to authorize a response. He said democracy, like it, was a disease. Rostova's breathing changed. Not visibly, her chest didn't rise and fall any differently. But something in her body shifted, the way a stone shifts just before an avalanche. She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. When she opened them, the temperature in the chamber seemed to drop. She reached toward the holographic interface embedded in her podium. Her hand moved with the certainty of someone accessing a code she had memorized decades ago, not debated, not voted on, not discussed in committee, memorized, practiced, waiting. The council delegates began to notice. In the tiered rings above and below, heads turned. Vianso's smile froze. He was accustomed to humans doing the thing humans always did, pleading, negotiating, requesting recesses to convene emergency sessions. This was different. Rostova's fingers found the biometric lock on her console. It was old technology, deliberately analog in a chamber full of quantum systems. It required a living hand, a heartbeat, a body willing to take responsibility for what came next. She placed her palm against the lock. It recognized her. Protocol 0, she said, and her voice dropped the rotunda's temperature another few degrees. Execute authorization. The console chimed, a soft sound, almost gentle. 3,000 kilometers below, in the crushing pressure of Neptune's deep gravity bands, where the atmosphere itself turned to diamond, Something ancient and patient began to wake. BLENDEDCTA, intro position, tilde 120 chars. The Zarithians thought they had bought time with a threat. They didn't realize time was exactly what they didn't have anymore. 47 minutes earlier, Elena Rostova had been reviewing the quarterly casualty reports from the orbital tiers. That was what the job entailed, names in columns, sorted by date. Rostova had always believed that numbers deserved faces. Every digit represented a person who had existed, had thought, had mattered. The reports had been routine, staffing levels normal, supply chains stable. No one had predicted the Akron tier would break. No one, except the people who had ordered it to break. Vianso's face filled the rotunda's screens again, his expression one of absolute confidence. He was watching Rostova's hand still pressed against the biometric lock, waiting for her to release it, waiting for the inevitable, the desperate scramble, the emergency recess, the call for consultation with Earth's parliament. He had done this calculation 1,000 times. Humanity was bound by procedure, by votes, by the requirement that you convince people before you could act. But Rostova's hand did not move. She was waiting too, waiting for something that had been waiting far longer than either of them had been alive. In the deep gravity bands of Neptune, the Leviathan grid's fusion reactors drank power from thermal vents that had burned in silence for 63 years. The osmium lances, hyperdense projectiles, each the size of a construction shuttle, rotated in their launch frames, acquiring targeting data from satellites that had been seeded across the solar system before the Zarithian hegemony even knew what the word humanity meant. Grid was not new. It was not secret. It was not technically a weapon. The treaties were very clear on that point. It was a deep space kinetic stabilization array, entirely defensive, entirely automated. It required no vote, no debate, no consensus. It required only one thing, the biometric confirmation of a sitting High Minister, spoken in the presence of the Aegis Rotunda, witnessed by 700 delegates representing every species the Zarithians had not yet subjugated. Vianso's smile finally cracked. He leaned back in his seat, his massive frame dwarfing the human delegates. High Minister, I don't believe you understand the gravity of. I understand gravity perfectly, Rostova said. Her voice was steady as stone. That's the problem for you. The metronome ticked. Vianso's hand moved toward the comm on his console, but he didn't touch it. That hesitation was the first crack. In the tiered rings above, the hegemony's supporting delegates leaned forward, waiting for their commander to laugh, to dismiss the human's bluff, to invoke the 17 subsections that made Earth's Protocol Zero a procedural fiction. Instead, Vianso's iridescent cranial plating shifted color, a tell. Humans couldn't read Zarithian biology well enough to know if it meant fear or rage. Rostova didn't need to know. The silence told her enough. The rotunda's primary feed showed the Akron Tier's debris field still tumbling. Rescue operations had begun, neutral stations launching triage ships. But the feed also showed something else. The Zarithian fleet was moving. 11,000 kilometers from Earth's orbital perimeter, 4,000 siege cruisers were charging their plasma batteries. Not yet firing, charging. A statement of intent. A final countdown. Vianso leaned back. High Minister, you are bluffing. There is no automated grid. There is no Protocol Zero. There is only a woman in a chamber full of witnesses claiming to have launched a weapon that doesn't exist. Then you have nothing to fear, Rostova said. She stood. In that chamber, standing meant something. It meant you were ending a statement, closing a door, refusing further negotiation. The human delegation stayed seated. They had learned years ago that showing solidarity through synchronized movement read as herd behavior to the rotunda's other species. Better to let Rostova stand alone. Vianso's smile returned, but it was different now. Thinner, a performance for an audience that was beginning to doubt him. The Zarithian hegemony will permit Earth 48 hours to formally surrender all weapons systems. After that time. Your deadline is already running, Rostova interrupted. You placed it on your console yourself. The metronome ticked, Tick, tick, tick. In the context of the last 5 minutes, the sound had transformed. It was no longer mocking. It was no longer a countdown to humanity's defeat. It was a countdown to something else entirely, and Vian So was beginning to understand that he had set the timer himself, out of arrogance. Rostova walked toward the chamber's exit. The human delegation did not follow her. Protocol required that at least one representative remain to hear any formal motions, but all of them understood what had just happened. The decision had been made, not by Parliament, not by committee, not by debate, by a woman who had memorized a code and spoken it aloud in front of 700 witnesses. Behind her, Vianso's voice rose. "Where are you going? The council has not dismissed you." Rostova didn't turn. "I'm going to watch the sky," she said quietly. "You should do the same." The Acherontiers' wreckage turned slowly against the black. In the rotundas, secondary feeds, the ones that the main chamber wasn't watching, something else was happening. Deep in Neptune's gravity well, where the pressure crushed normal matter into exotic configurations, the Leviathan grid's primary reactor chambers had reached operating temperature. 63 years of dormancy ending in the space of minutes. The osmium lances, each one a cylinder the size of a construction shuttle, hyperdense enough to warp space around it, were rotating in their launch frames. The targeting telemetry was already locked. It had been locked for months. The moment the Acherontier was destroyed, the grid's autonomous systems had detected the gravitational signatures of the Zarithian fleet and begun the acquisition sequence. No human had given an order for that. The system had been designed so that it didn't require one. It had been designed by a parliament that had looked at the history of the galaxy and decided that waiting for consensus was a luxury they could not afford. The grid's fusion cores sang at the edge of the electromagnetic spectrum, a song only sensitive instruments could hear. And in the vast chamber of Neptune's atmosphere, where the wind speeds exceeded anything Earth had ever recorded, the osmium lances acquired their final targeting locks. The Zarithian fleet still didn't know. Their sensors registered gravitational anomalies in the deep gravity bands. VNSO's tactical officers interpreted them as warp field fluctuations, the kind of spatial distortion that happened near massive gas giants. They filed reports. They adjusted course slightly. They remained absolutely, perfectly unaware that they were being painted with targeting lasers that moved at the speed of light. In the human delegation's quarters, Rostova sat alone and watched the live feeds. 41,809 names scrolled past on a secondary display, the casualty rolls from the Acherontier. She had requested them an hour before the council session. She had read every single one, not scanned. Read, names, ages, positions, the small biographical markers that made each person distinct from the sum total. Now she was reading them again. One of her aides, a young woman named Keiko Tanaka, appeared in the doorway. She was holding a datapad that was probably important. They all were in these hours. But she stopped when she saw Rostova's face. "The Parliament is demanding a full briefing," Keiko said carefully. "They want to know if Protocol Zero is actually—" "It's real," Rostova said. She didn't look away from the casualty rolls. "Tell them it's real. Tell them it was activated. Tell them to start writing the statements they're going to need." "Statements for what?" Keiko asked. Rostova turned to face her aide. Her expression was perfectly calm, but there was something beneath it, not anger, but something older, something that had been waiting decades for this moment. "For 41,809 funerals," Rostova said, "and for the moment when the Zarithian hegemony stops existing as a military power." Keiko's face went very still. She understood then. She understood what Rostova had done in that chamber. Not a bluff, not a gamble, a certainty, a mechanism that had been waiting in the dark for exactly this kind of moment. "How long?" Keiko asked. Rostova turned back to the feeds. On one screen, the Acherontier's wreckage continued its slow tumble. On another screen, a Zarithian ship's targeting console blinked with a status report. All systems nominal, all weapons charged, ready to fire. Depends on how fast gravity moves, Rostova said. The grid fires at fractional light speed. The light lag from Neptune to the Zarithian fleet is approximately 83 minutes. So from the moment the grid fires to the moment the strikes land. She paused. 83 minutes, she said. They'll know what's coming, and there's nothing they can do about it. They'll watch it happen on their sensors. They'll have time to know they're dead before they actually die. The metronome's tick echoed through the rotunda's broadcast feed. It was still running on Vian-So's console in that vast chamber of witnesses. It was still counting down to something, but it wasn't counting down to humanity's surrender anymore. It was counting down to the moment when a civilization learned that it had made a catastrophic error in understanding what procedure really meant. In the command center of the Zarithian fleet, Vian-So sat in his flagship's bridge, watching the telemetry feeds. The human High Minister had been bluffing, obviously. A woman couldn't just activate an ancient doomsday weapon by touching a console. There had to be confirmations, layers of approval, debate, time. The Zarithian hegemony had conquered a dozen species, and every single one of them had required at least 2 weeks of negotiation before they actually surrendered. Humanity would be no different. Except humanity was different. Humanity was a species that had looked at the history of the galaxy and decided that the moment when you needed to fire at an enemy was not the moment to start asking for permission. The Leviathan grid's primary reactor reached maximum output. The osmium lances rotated once more, acquiring final targeting lock. And in the deep gravity bands of Neptune, where no one was watching, where no broadcast feed was recording, where nothing existed but pressure and cold and the slow spin of a gas giant, the grid fired. 4,000 osmium slugs, each the size of a construction shuttle, each moving at fractional light speed, each with a trajectory calculated by decades of paranoia and preparation. 83 minutes from now, the Zarithian hegemony would cease to be a military power. 83 minutes from now, Vian-So would watch his fleet die in real time, unable to do anything but watch, unable to dodge, unable to defend, unable to do anything except understand with perfect clarity that he had been wrong about what human democracy meant. It didn't mean hesitation. It meant that when the moment came to act, there were no committees, no votes, no debate, just a woman touching a console and speaking a single word, execute. The metronome ticked on, counting down the 83 minutes it would take for certainty to become ash. The first impact hit the Zarithian flagship's starboard drive coupling at 0.47 light speed, and Vian-So felt the deck pitch beneath him. Not an explosion, not chaos, just a single precise shear, an osmium lance the size of a cargo shuttle punching through the propulsion linkage and exiting clean on the other side. The strike left a wound that was mathematically perfect, surgical, deliberate. The bridge alarms came a half-second later, cascading across every system at once. All ships reporting drive failures, his tactical officer gasped. The man's hands were shaking across his console. The entire formation. The strikes they came from inside the system. Neptune origin, deep gravity sources. Sir, the vectors they're not possible. Nothing moves that fast without. The second wave arrived. This time the osmium lances targeted the weapon arrays. 4,000 siege cruisers. 4,000 plasma batteries that had been charged and locked on Earth for 17 hours, waiting for Vian-So's order to fire. All of them died in 30 seconds, not from overload, not from cascade failure, from precision strikes that sheared the weapon pods clean off the hull frames, leaving the crew compartments untouched, leaving the crews alive, leaving them helpless. Return fire, Vian-So ordered. Sir, we can't, his tactical officer's voice cracked. The targeting systems are offline, the drives are dead. The weapon pods they're gone. Sir, whatever this is, it's not a weapon we have a counter for. It's not even a weapon. It's its math. The metronome on Vian-So's console continued ticking. He had placed it there to mock a woman who couldn't act. Now it was counting down the time until his fleet became scrap. 83 minutes of light lag. 83 minutes between the moment the lances fired and the moment they hit. 83 minutes for him to watch his certainty die on the tactical displays. Vienso's hand moved toward the console's emergency beacon, but he stopped. Broadcasting a distress call would only confirm what was already obvious. The Zarithian hegemony had just been systematically dismantled by an enemy that wasn't even visible. In the Aegis Rotunda, the council chamber erupted. Not in unified panic. These were 700 delegates from 100 species, each with their own protocols and procedures. But underneath the shouting, underneath the demands for immediate action and the calls for council intervention, there was a singular realization taking hold. The Zarithian hegemony, which had conquered a dozen worlds through the threat of overwhelming force, had just been rendered powerless without a single shot being fired in return. High Minister Alina Rostova stood at the chamber's entrance, exactly where she had been for 83 minutes, waiting. The human delegation had informed her when the lances fired, when they reached the Zarithian fleet, when the last weapon pod went dark. She had stood in absolute stillness and counted down the moments to the galaxy's restructuring. A crystalline elder from the Tessarian collective stood, demanding intervention. A hegemony-aligned delegate called for immediate ceasefire protocols. Another voice, from the neutral collective, asked if this constituted an act of war requiring defensive response. Rostova walked back into the chamber. "The osmium lances have completed their targeting sequence," she said, and her voice was so quiet that the chamber had to silence itself to hear her. "The Zarithian fleet is no longer capable of projecting military force in this sector. Every drive system is offline. Every weapon pod is severed. Every crew is alive and transmitting life support signals." She paused at the central speaking position, exactly where Vienso had stood 40 minutes earlier, issuing his ultimatum. "The Akron Tears crew was also alive," Rostova continued, "until the moment your civilization decided they were expendable. Now I am asking you a question, Sovereign Elector, and the Rotunda is listening." Vienso's face appeared on the primary feed. Blood ran from a laceration across his cranial plating. He had been thrown against his console during the impacts, but his expression was perfectly controlled. He had understood, in the space of those 30 seconds of impacts, that everything he had believed about human democracy was a fiction built on catastrophic misunderstanding. "What question?" he asked. "Do you require rescue?" Rostova said. The silence that followed swallowed the entire chamber. 4,000 warships drifting in the black. Crews that had expected to be victorious, now stranded. No propulsion. No weapons. No way to escape except by accepting assistance from the species they had tried to subjugate. "Yes," Vienso said finally. His voice was steady. That steadiness was the worst part. It meant he had accepted the reversal completely. "We require rescue." The human triage vessels launched from Earth's orbital docks 90 seconds after the weapon pods fell silent. Not warships, not combat platforms, medical ships, engineering support craft. Vessels designed to dock with crippled hulls and keep crews alive during catastrophic system failures. Keiko Tanaka watched the launch sequence from the human delegation's tactical display. 23 medical vessels, 41 engineering platforms, 60 support shuttles, all of them accelerating at rates that would have been suicidal for most species, but which humanity had spent 63 years preparing to sustain. She turned to Rostova, who was still standing at the chamber's center. "First docking sequence initiates in 47 minutes, Keiko said. "We're transmitting full engineering schematics now. Drive restoration protocols, medical databases, everything they need to survive until they can leave." Rostova nodded once. She was still watching Vienso's face on the feed, watching the realization settling into his expression. The moment when certainty became ash. The moment when he understood that humanity had not debated its defense. Humanity had automated it. 63 years of paranoia and preparation, waiting for exactly the moment when hesitation was no longer an option. "The rescue is unconditional," Rostova said, loud enough for the chamber to hear. Medical accords apply. No terms, no negotiation. They will be treated as any other species would be treated. A hegemony delegate rose. High Minister, what happens after the repairs are complete? Rostova turned to face the full assembly. The human delegation remained seated, unmoved. They had known what was coming since the moment Protocol Zero had been activated. They had been inside the calculation. After the repairs are complete, Rostova said, the Zarithian fleet will depart, and then the sole boundary will be sealed. Sealed? The delegate asked. Any armed vessel crossing the line will be dismantled without warning, Rostova said. No council vote, no debate, no procedure, just automated systems doing what they were designed to do. She gestured, and Keiko activated the archive display. The image that appeared was the Rotunda's permanent historical record, the vast, unalterable database that documented every major event in galactic history. Rostova had spent the last 83 minutes inputting the data herself. 41,809 names. Not statistics, names, individual entries. A child, a dock worker, a scientist, a teacher, a person, each one visible on the display, each one unchangeable. The archive would hold them forever, and no council procedure could strike them from the record. They are entered, Rostova said. The Akron will be remembered as the moment when the galaxy learned that humanity's restraint is not weakness. It is the choice to spare you when we could destroy you. On the Zarithian flagship's bridge, a junior officer named Shiath, who had been monitoring the incoming rescue vessels, suddenly understood something that made her body go rigid. The human medical protocols were being transmitted in real time, not withheld, not used as leverage, transmitted openly. And in those protocols, Shiath could see the full extent of what the human rescue operation was doing, not just saving the Zarithian crews, but actively sharing medical resources. The human support ships were operating at reduced efficiency, reducing their own capacity to ensure the Zarithian fleet had what it needed to survive. It was not mercy. Mercy implied weakness. This was something far more precise. It was the demonstration of absolute restraint by a civilization that could have annihilated them completely and had chosen not to. Shiath turned to Vianso. Sir, she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had just glimpsed the true architecture of what had happened. The rescue crews are sharing their own medical supplies. They're operating at partial efficiency to keep us alive. Vianso didn't respond immediately. He was still looking at the metronome, still watching it count down. 68 hours remaining. The device had become a symbol of something neither of them had anticipated. Not the countdown to Earth's defeat, but the countdown to the moment when the Zarithian hegemony would have to leave, would have to return to hegemony space, would have to explain to the High Command that they had been wrong about what human weakness meant. Sir, Shiath continued, when we return to the home fleets, what do we tell them? What is the report? The silence that followed was the moment when the story's second-order consequences became visible. The Zarithian hegemony was not monolithic. There were factions, interests, power structures that had depended entirely on the assumption that newer species could be subjugated through the threat of superior force. That assumption had just been proved catastrophically false in front of 700 witnesses. And every species in the Rotunda was beginning to understand the implication. The sole boundary was not just a defensive line. It was a declaration. The galaxy had just learned, in the most precise and surgical way possible, that there were limits to what could be done, and those limits were enforced not by negotiation or council vote, but by automated systems that had been waiting decades for exactly the moment when debate had to stop. We tell them the truth, Vianso said finally, his voice dropping lower than before. We tell them we were wrong about what human weakness means. The metronome ticked on, and in that sound was the entire restructuring of galactic power, compressed into a rhythm that would echo for generations. 47 minutes later, the first human medical shuttle docked with the Zarithian flagship's starboard airlock. The seal was perfect. The coupling held. And then the airlock opened, and human medics in sealed suits walked onto a bridge full of beings who had expected to be victorious and were instead stranded in the dark. Vienso did not move from his seat. He watched the medics begin their work, stabilizing his injured officers, running diagnostics on the life support systems, transmitting real-time data back to the engineering platforms that were already beginning repairs on the primary drives. It was efficient. It was competent. It was completely devoid of triumph or mercy. Just work. Just the machinery of rescue, executed with the same cold precision that had dismantled his fleet. A medical officer approached Vienso's command chair. Human, female, her voice steady through the translation matrix. Sovereign Elector, we're beginning primary drive restoration. Your crew will have full propulsion within 16 hours. Medical teams are standing by for any injuries. Vienso looked at her. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Not gratitude, not relief, but recognition. This woman had come to save the life of a being who, 6 hours earlier, had ordered the destruction of 41,000 civilians. She had come because procedure demanded it, because humanity's restraint was not kindness, it was discipline. Acknowledged, he said. The medic nodded and returned to her work. Behind her, other human support crews were already moving through the ship, interfacing with Zarithian systems, sharing protocols, offering expertise. No gloating, no reminders of the defeat, just the quiet, relentless machinery of rescue. Vienso's hand moved to the metronome on his console. The device had stopped ticking 3 minutes ago, frozen at the exact moment of the rescue's initiation. He picked it up, held it in his palm. The crystalline surface was still warm from the console's ambient heat. It was such a small thing to carry the weight of an entire civilization's miscalculation. In the Aegis Rotunda, Rostova stood before the chamber's permanent archive display. The interface was ancient by the standards of that chamber, deliberately analog in places, resistant to remote access or digital manipulation. Once a name was entered, it could never be removed. Once a record was set, it could never be changed. She had been entering the names for the last 85 minutes. Keiko stood beside her, reading from the casualty manifests, calling out each name in sequence. Rostova's fingers moved across the haptic keyboard with the methodical precision of someone who understood that each entry was a person, not a number, not a statistic. A human being who had existed and now did not exist because of a decision made in this very chamber. One name at a time, a child, a worker, a teacher, a scientist, a person. Rainer Okoy, Keiko read. Age 7, Colonial Recreation Specialist, Akrantir, Section 4. Rostova entered the name. On the display, it joined the others, a bright point in a constellation of the dead. 41,000 points of light. 41,000 small stories, now part of the permanent record. Marcus Chen, age 43, mining engineer, Akrantir, Section 2. Another name, another light, another person whose existence would be recorded forever, unchangeable, eternal. The rotunda had gone quiet hours ago. 700 delegates had watched the first 1,000 names being entered, then the second 1,000, then the 5th 1,000. By the 10,000 mark, the chamber had fallen into a silence so complete that only Keiko's voice reading the names and Rostova's fingers on the keyboard made any sound at all. The metronome's broadcast tick from Vienso's abandoned console had stopped as well. The device had reached its zero, its purpose fulfilled, and now it sat silent on the chair where the sovereign elector had been sitting when he understood that he had miscalculated. Dmitry Volkov, age 56, senior systems engineer, Akrantir, Section 1. Amara Osa, age 31, hydroponics technician, Akrantir, Section 3. James Patterson, age 47, structural integrity officer, Akrantir, Section 2. Names, each one a life, each one a story that had ended without warning, without chance, without mercy. And now they were being entered into the permanent record of the galaxy. They would exist in this archive forever. long after the Zarithian hegemony had restructured itself, long after new powers rose and fell, long after the humans who had spoken these names into the record were dust. The dead were being witnessed. That was what Rostova was doing. That was what this ceremony meant. In a galaxy where power was measured in fleets and weapons and the ability to destroy, humanity was demonstrating a different kind of power. The power to remember, the power to record, the power to make certain that the dead could not be forgotten, could not be rewritten, could not be erased from history. The 83,000th name was entered at 22:47 hours, coordinated Earth time. Keiko called out the last name, her voice steady but quiet. Victoria Zhao, age 26, medical officer, Akron Tier, Section 5. Rostova entered it. The display flickered once, acknowledging the final entry. 41,809 names. Complete, recorded, permanent. She stepped back from the archive interface. Her hands were steady, but something had changed in her bearing. The weight of the task was complete. The names were safe in the permanent record. No one could delete them. No one could amend them. No one could argue that they had never existed. Keiko handed her a small data chip. On it was a single file, a summary of the Akron Tier incident, the names of the dead, the Zarithian decision to destroy the mining tier, the demand for unconditional surrender, the activation of Protocol Zero, the firing of the osmium lances, the rescue operation that was still ongoing, with human triage vessels docking with Zarithian ships, saving crews that had expected to die in the black. All of it. The entire chain of events that had led humanity from a species that could be ordered to kneel to a species that had reset the galaxy's understanding of what power actually meant. Rostova walked to the center of the chamber, where the metronome still sat on the abandoned console. She picked it up. The crystalline device was cool in her hand now, its internal mechanisms frozen at the moment of completion. 83 minutes. That was how long it had taken for certainty to become ash. The chamber erupted into motion as she approached the speaking position. Delegates were standing, calling out, demanding answers. The crystalline elders wanted clarification on the new boundary. The neutral collective wanted assurance that human defensiveness wouldn't escalate into aggression. The remaining hegemony-aligned representatives wanted time to contact their home fleets to begin the process of understanding what had happened to their civilization's supremacy. Rostova raised her hand once, and the chamber fell silent. In that silence was the accumulated weight of everything that had occurred in the last 6 hours. The destruction of the Akron Tier, the demand for surrender, the activation of Protocol Zero, the dismantling of 4,000 warships, the rescue operation that was still bringing the Zarithian crews back from the brink of death, the 41,000 names now permanent in the archive. The Akron Tier is entered, Rostova said, and her voice carried the weight of finality. The names are recorded. The dead are witnessed. She paused. The chamber held its breath. The sole boundary is now sealed, she continued. Any armed vessel crossing that line will be dismantled without warning, not by committee vote, not by debate, not by procedure, by the systems we built to protect what we love. A delegate from the far tier stood. High Minister, you're declaring unilateral authority over an entire sector of space. The Council has jurisdictions. The Council watched, Rostova said quietly. The Council watched while the Zarithian hegemony destroyed 41,000 civilians. The Council filed motions. The Council debated procedure. And while the Council was debating, the Akron Tier was breaking apart in the black. She turned the metronome in her hands, letting the light catch the crystalline faces. Humanity has decided that when the moment comes to defend ourselves, we will not debate, Rostova said. We debate our diplomacy. Our survival is automated. She set the metronome down on the speaking podium. The device sat there, stopped at zero, a monument to the moment when certainty had shattered. Around it, the rotunda's lights reflected off the crystalline faces, casting small rainbows across the chamber's polished floor. As Rostova spoke, the last Zarithian ship was receiving its final drive restoration protocols from the human engineering platform. On the bridge of the flagship, Vianso stood and walked to the observation port. Outside, Earth hung in the black, a blue marble rotating slowly, indifferent to empires and power struggles and the calculations of beings who thought themselves invulnerable. He had ordered the destruction of the Acheron tier because he had believed that humanity's democracy made them weak. He had believed that debate and procedure were luxuries that prevented action. He had believed that a species that required consensus could never move fast enough to defend itself. He had been catastrophically wrong. The human medics had finished their work. The drives were restored. The life support systems were stable. The Zarithian fleet could leave whenever they chose to. They could begin the long journey back to hegemony space and face whatever consequences awaited them there. Shiath appeared at Vian So's side, the junior officer who had questioned what they would tell the home fleets. She was holding a datapad, and her expression was grave. "Sir," she said, "the human High Minister just declared the sole boundary sealed. Any armed vessel." "I know," Vianso said. He was still looking at Earth, still trying to understand the moment when his certainty had become ash. "Send a message to the Hegemony Command. Tell them that the Zarithian hegemony has encountered a civilization that automates what we debate. Tell them that we were wrong about what human weakness means. Tell them that we are returning home with 40,000 crew members alive because a species we tried to subjugate chose mercy over vindication." He paused. "And tell them," he continued, "that the galaxy has a new rule now, and it was written by a woman who spoke a single word and backed it up with decades of paranoia and mathematics." Rostova walked out of the Aegis Rotunda without looking back. The human delegation followed her, silent, moving with the precision of a military unit that had executed a strategy perfectly. Behind them, the rotunda descended into chaos, delegates demanding clarifications, protocol officers scrambling to update the galactic legal frameworks, the Tessarian crystalline elders calling for emergency sessions to discuss the implications of a new sealed boundary in human space. But none of that mattered. The decision had been made. The names had been recorded. The dead had been witnessed. The boundary had been set. And humanity had returned to doing what it did best, protecting what it loved with the calm certainty of a species that had learned long ago that some decisions could not be debated. In the archive, 41,809 lights glowed. Not forgotten, not erased, not negotiable, simply there forever, a weight that would never lighten. The metronome sat on the podium, stopped at 0, a monument to the moment when certainty had become ash. And in the deep gravity bands of Neptune, the Leviathan grid's fusion reactors powered down to standby mode, waiting for the next time humanity might need them, waiting for the next civilization that might mistake restraint for weakness, waiting for the next moment when a woman would touch a console and speak a single word, and the galaxy would have to learn once again what human weakness actually meant.